All right, let's get started. So today, guys, as we've talked about before, we want to look at sort of intra-Asian politics because we spend enough of our time talking about Ukraine, U.S. China, Europe China, non-China issues. But there's a lot going on in Asia that we simply don't cover. Sometimes gets swept under the rug when global events dictate. And it really matters, especially for the development of the region. And obviously, it ripples out into the rest of the world because, as we all know, Asia is rising. So I wanted to start, I guess, today with the whole Vietnam China summit going on right now. I'll butcher his name, Nate, but Trong met with Xi Jinping. A big deal. One of the first people, if not the first, right, to meet with Xi post third term crowning. So I guess why does this matter, or what's happening, and why does this matter?
Sure. So, yeah, as you said, the chairman of the Vietnamese Communist Party, Nguyen Phu Trong, visited his counterpart, Xi Jinping, in Beijing. That meeting's already concluded, but a lot happened during it. It is important for the two countries to keep each other, sort of close. China does not want Vietnam straying too far into the U.S. camp. Vietnam also wants to have a level of predictability in its relationship with China because the two of them have, of course, an intractable maritime dispute in the South China Sea. An interesting wrinkle to this is that Traum is not the head of state of Vietnam. He's the leader of the party. And this indicates that the vector of party-to-party relationships between the Chinese Communist Party and the Vietnamese Communist Party is a more fluid avenue than state-to-state relations. So obviously on the state side, they handle security issues. They have a lot of tensions. They're, both worried about oil excavation, for example, in the South China Sea. But when it's the party heads talking on party stuff, they can lean more into ideology. They can work to legitimize their respective models, which are basically the same model. And it's a way for them to sort of diffuse tensions and have a friendly back and forth that doesn't involve the head of state.
So I guess that ideology part, like the difference between their parties trying to say we get along and the states being like we have some real beef with each other, is interesting to me because it seems like they're both communist parties in name, right? The Vietnamese Communist Party and the Chinese Communist Party, but they seem to want very different things ideologically. China's very much trying to push for this, Beijing, I should say, trying to push for this world vision that our model of governance can be a viable alternative to Western liberal democracies. And they're trying to push this vision in the world and sort of make some elbow room for their version of governance. Is Vietnam doing the same thing?
In a sense, a very minimized version of what you're talking about. Vietnam does not proselytize its model to the same extent that China does, in fact, at all. They're very quiet about it. But at home, they have an interest in maintaining the legitimacy of one-party leadership, obviously. So, for detractors at home, the domestic audience in Vietnam, this is helpful to prop up this model so that people don't get other ideas. Of course, they don't go abroad spreading the model. They're not super on board with this whole push by Beijing to, set up a viable alternative to the West. They're not a part of that narrative at all. But it is useful for domestic consumption, certainly.
Do you get the sense that because in China the narrative for the longest time was hide your strength and bide your time, right? If we want this global narrative and this global room for ourselves as a power, just wait till we get stronger, then we can talk about global ideology and all this stuff. Do you get the sense the same conversations going on in Vietnam where they're having this hide and bide conversation, or is it not really fair to put that same model on Vietnam's Communist Party?
No, I don't think so. China, as a major power, great power, if you will, has the capacity to theorize about that discussion. Vietnam is a middle power. Its needs rely on balancing its relationships with other countries, with the great powers, namely Beijing, Moscow, and Washington. Vietnam pivots between the three of them at will. Its foreign policy allows it a great degree of flexibility in engaging with the three of them. And therefore, in the interest of maintaining a balance there, they're not interested in pushing this model internationally, or at least not being vocal about it.
Right. And you would say not now and not really for any time in the foreseeable future.
Yeah,
It's not like they're still waiting.
no. I mean, that's not going to happen. Of course, historically, the Vietnamese Communist Party was much more ideological. They were aligned with the communist revolutions of the past. They were more aligned with the Soviet Union than with communist China after the Sino-Soviet split. And they did tout ideology as part of the Soviet aligned world. But since the 80s, really, they've kind of discarded all talk of that. Of course, there's still propaganda about the glory of the party, but the real meaty ideological components of its governing model are fairly muted, even at home. Um, they tie their legitimacy to raising the standard of living, to economic development, less so on this notion that they're proselytizing for the good of the world, sort of a utopian vision. They've discarded that for the most part.
Right. To your point,
and
very much an emerging country viewpoint.
Exactly.
So I guess the biggest question coming out of Washington is like China going to yank Vietnam away? What do you think?
I don't know. So in the Biden administration, they've been a little bit slow to engage with Vietnam. So Donald Trump, Biden's predecessor, extended a similar invitation to Trump during his time in office. Trump could not attend at the time. He was in poor health. His health is apparently better now, enough to travel to Beijing, and Biden has not extended an invitation. So we're sort of waiting to see if that is forthcoming. But there's some slowed momentum in the U.S.-Vietnam security cooperation. So after Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, Vietnam did two things to show its displeasure with that. They canceled an aircraft carrier visit to one of their ports, and they canceled participation in the RIMPAC naval drills that the U.S. leads. So this was intended to show displeasure at the Pelosi visit. They thought it, sparked unnecessary tension in the region. Maybe it was a signal to China that, hey, we're not really on board with U.S. maneuvering. So you can see here that they're very much driven to, orient this way, orient that way, as external developments shape the view of their needs. So they're not going to be too vocal for anybody. They're going to be very withdrawn and not be very vocal.
Right, which makes sense for a middle power not wanting to cut off any of its options.
Absolutely. Yeah. I will add that the situation with Russia also throws a wrench into Vietnamese foreign policymaking. Russia has traditionally been Vietnam's best friend, top partner. That's still more or less the case. But with Russia's diminishing status on the world stage, this also forces an impetus in Hanoi to make decisions about what to do when your top patron is declining. They're going further into China's camp. So the Moscow option is less valuable at this moment in time. And they need to branch out, and especially to China. That's the one out of the three countries, three great powers, so to speak, that they really need to improve relations with.
But I guess, what is Vietnam? Are they doing anything with this, or is this just your thinking on what the calculus is in Hanoi right now? For example, are they cutting any ties with Russia, or are they just kind of being quiet because it's not cool to support an invasion of a country?
Yeah, they're being quiet, and they have been quiet is a good way of putting it, but they've supported Russia in a lot of the UNGA, United Nations General Assembly votes. Not all of them. Some of them, have sided with, some of the votes have sided with Ukraine, but on a lot of the major voting that's going on there, Vietnam does still side with Russia. They had a high-profile visit with the foreign minister, I think, back in August. They're not doing anything to cut back with Moscow, but they do have to keep in mind that Moscow is not the power that it used to be, and this will affect, Vietnam's own planning for the future.
Gotcha. So like a strategic reality, but no sudden movements.
Yes, no sudden movements.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, well, let's hop on over to a bit more of a kinetic situation going on over there in North Korea and South Korea. They seem to be having a contest to see who can look stronger with their weapons, throwing them at each other. So, Scott, what's happening?
Well, the United States and South Korea are currently engaging in these aerial drills called Vigilant Storm. I mean, they're huge. It was started on Monday and it was supposed to end today, but they decided to extend them. North Korea voiced their displeasure and said, "Hey, you guys better stop these drills, or we'll respond." And then they did actually by firing a missile over the northern limit line. That's kind of like the maritime border. How I look on camera here, kind of like the DMZ extended into the waters. They lobbed it over the basically the northern limit line near Sokcho, and that's a really nice, popular beach destination on the East Coast. It's about 60 kilometers away, or roughly 40 some odd miles, 43 miles or something like that off the coast. I mean, it's pretty close, but it's not, it's not like they're, striking, 100 meters off the beach. So it wasn't like North Korea was trying to hit anything, because they probably could have hit something if they really wanted to, but they were showing their displeasure by saying, look, we said that we would do something in response. Here's our response. And then, of course, in response to the North Korean response, South Korea conducted their own air to surface missile demonstration, where they fired some of their own missiles from, I believe, is F-35s into the waters off the coast of North Korea. Kind of their own demonstration again. And I know a lot of people in the media portray this as, oh no, this is a big escalation. Oh, like, what's North Korea doing? This is North Korea truly responding to South Korean and American drills. Now, to also be very clear, the South Korean and American drills at the time were not being conducted pointing at North Korea. They weren't like, skimming the DMZ saying, haha, look at us. I mean, a couple of them could have, but for the most part, the drills don't actively take place in a very, very provocative manner right on the DMZ. They'll take place off the DMZ, close-ish, but they're not going to be like walking the fence of the DMZ and doing drills there.
Gotcha. So that's sort of like the tactical, where exactly we're at right now.
Yeah.
No one should have their hair on fire. Nothing crazy is happening here.
Yeah.
But let's zoom out for the strategic, for that view of, and we've talked about this before, what this means for North Korea's capabilities to sort of push its policy on the world, right? Because usually it's either they say nothing or they say, we'll nuke you to oblivion. And that obviously has some pros and cons to only having two options. So what is this signal?
Well, the signals that North Korea actually not only one has options between, I'm going to use artillery and shell Seoul, which is pretty close to the DMZ, or I'm going to nuke Seoul or try to nuke Washington, D.C. That's a pretty big jump between those two things. So now North Korea actually has the options between that, saying we have some ballistic missiles that we can use. They can target specific locations, and that they're confident in these systems. So when we look at it, it says, okay, instead of just threatening to turn Seoul into, or South Korea into a sea of fire, that's what they said when I was there multiple times. Now they can say, well, oh yeah, yeah. Just imagine your family seeing that. Yeah, the calls I get at 3 a.m. were nice. But just imagine, like, now North Korea can say, hey, we don't need to just throw artillery or threaten to nuke you. Now we can say, hey, we can hit Pohang, where POSCO Steel is. That's a big steel manufacturer, and we could just hit it with a couple ballistic missiles, and that suddenly changes the escalation ladder, because you don't have to go from 0 to 60. You can accelerate, and you have different tiers that you can achieve. Now, broadly speaking, then what this means is we can start looking at arms control, because for a long time North Korea was like, if we only have nukes, we'll never give up nukes ever, because that's their only option. But now suddenly, if North Korea has nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles in between, now we can look at arms reduction and control along these, rather than saying, well, if you don't give up your nukes, nothing happens, and North Korea says, well, that's a non-starter for our discussions. So,
gotcha.
I think that's where they're going with that.
So where does this current spat go? So they've been doing this for, it seems, a few days now. Every day you wake up and go to work and you have to cover something new that North Korea and or South Korea has done. So where does this spat go? Is this like the Pelosi visit to Taiwan, which triggered military exercises, and of course the status quo has changed a little bit, but in general the situation tails off? Or because we still have that nuclear test somewhere in the background on the schedule, like, does that reinvigorate some of this back and forth, or is that a totally separate issue? So there's two things going on here, and how do you see them developing?
Well, I see part of this, like you bring up Taiwan. That's a really good point. What I believe China did after the Pelosi visits, when they, conducted those military drills around Taiwan, is they're trying to heighten tensions and create kind of a new normal. North Korea is partially doing that. They're saying, hey, if we start lobbing more missiles over, you kind of get used to it, right? You just get fatigued from hearing so much news about another missile launch that you're like, oh, it's another one. Congratulations, today's Monday. And part of it is them actually probing the the pretty new Yoon administration. Yoon Suk Yeol took office earlier this year. He's been dealing with some North Korean issues, but they're trying to see how will he respond to North Korea? How will he respond to these different attacks and provocations? And has the South Korean military changed the rules of engagement? Will South Korea launch a rocket into North Korea, not just the water, but will they actually launch it into North Korean land? Or are they going to restrain themselves and keep to south of the northern limit line? Or are they going to maybe, encroach on what is considered North Korean territory? So we have a couple factors in that, and we're gonna see that going forward. And you mentioned the nuclear test. That's about a month or so ago, the South Korean National Intelligence Service said between October 16th and November 7th, that's when North Korea can do a nuclear test.
Yeah, clock's ticking.
Yeah, clock's ticking, very much so. And that doesn't mean that is the only time. Like you said, they could just say, no, we'll do it November 8th, But North Korea does have a nuclear test that pretty much everyone and all intelligence agencies have said publicly that they're ready. They have all the capabilities to do it. And there's no real reason that North Korea can't, like physically can't, unless there's something going behind the scenes that we don't know about, we're not privy to.
So do you see this new test coming up convincing the West and potentially, the US specifically, that, trying to denuclearize North Korea is clearly not going to happen? We keep trying this, and then they every once in a while make these tests. So do they sort of get to a realization that we do need to look at arms control rather than denuclearization? Or is it more of this more short-term reaction that we tend to get, where there's a nuclear test and everyone says, oh no, they're a crazy regime, we can't let them do this anymore, and sort of we revisit the same old conversations on the Korean Peninsula?
I guarantee you we're going to see revisiting the same old conversations.
Oh, good.
I can already see the CNN headlines for for a week after the test, showing footage of Kim Jong-un saying, oh no, he wants to kill everyone. North Korea is doing this test because they want to be recognized as a nuclear country. They want to be recognized as a nuclear power, and they want to remove this discussion of denuclearization because the Kim regime views that nuclear weapons are their only ticket to regime safety and stability from outside external attack or coercion.
Right, and they have reason to believe that based on history. Got a question popping up here. It's relevant, might as well go with it. So from Joel here, North Korea's capability to produce ballistic missiles. Can they just lob off a missile every now and then and say, technically we have the ability, or do they really have production capacity for this to be a real deterrent for South Korea?
They have enough of a capacity to produce. I don't want to put a hard number on that because I couldn't. But they have enough capacity to produce enough weapons that when they fire off one or two, it's not like they only have one left. They definitely have enough capacity to produce these. I think off the top of my head, for nuclear weapons, there's a suspected 40 to 60 weapons that they have, and I think they have the production capacity to create even more per year, like several. I think it's like a dozen or two per year. But I have to double check my figures on that.
Which from their perspective, is that enough to threaten Seoul reasonably?
Oh yeah. Because the other thing too is, if you're going to threaten Seoul has 10 million people in Seoul, 15 million people in the surrounding suburbs, Gyeonggi-do. So you got half the population of South Korea within an hour's drive of the DMZ. You don't need a lot of arms to threaten Seoul. And if we look at their long-range missile tests, they're looking at, potentially threatening the continental United States. Major cities like, LA or San Francisco. I guess I remember that one footage they saw Austin, Texas was a target. So
what about more closer on the Korean Peninsula, farther from Seoul, I should say, but
Yeah.
not quite the U.S. West Coast. Are they looking at having similar capabilities to threaten like other U.S. bases in the southern part of
Okinawa would
Korea?
definitely.
Okay.
Yeah, Okinawa would also definitely be on the table, but again, it's kind of weird. North Korea still retains a lot of animosity against Japan over the Japanese colonization in World War II. And so I wouldn't be surprised if North Korea definitely was like, well, if we can strike, Seoul, we can, testing our longer range missiles, we can also maybe hit Okinawa because that's where a lot of U.S. Forces are stationed as well.
Right, but would you say right now they don't really seem to care as much about that? They don't really seem to be pushing the limit on threatening to turn San Francisco into a sea of glass or Okinawa. Instead, a lot of this is geared towards Seoul right now, right? Or South Korea in general.
Yeah, it's weird. Sometimes he'll flip flop occasionally. You'll see that he'll threaten to turn Seoul into a sea of fire. And then earlier this year, he was saying, oh no, we actually don't think South Korea is the enemy. It's the West, it's Washington. They're the puppet masters, and poor South Korea is controlled by them.
So
you
it
do see that
depends.
flip flop sometimes. But I mean, definitely attacking South Korea is on the table, and it is a deterrence. North Korea says if for us to stay alive, we need to be able to realistically threaten South Korea and the United States.
So I guess sticking with South Korea, but moving over to Japan a bit, we've been looking at this supposed rapprochement, this closer relations between South Korea and Japan because they have this history. They hate each other because the South Koreans say the Japanese did awful things to us, and the Japanese say, "Oh, just get over it. We can have close economic ties." This has been a conversation for decades now. But the Yoon administration in South Korea seems to be really trying to make some headway in this relationship. Are we seeing anything meaningful here? And then because it matters, right? This matters for the U.S. position of containing China, so to speak, in the region. Is if their closest military partners, South Korea and Japan, can never get along, that becomes a really difficult mission. So how do you see this? Have there been any meaningful developments with this ROK Japan rapprochement?
The biggest development that's happening, I believe, next week is the Japanese Navy is going to participate in the fleet review outside of Tokyo. And it's basically like kind of instead of a physical military parade you see where the generals and presidents are watching and saluting, it's just a navy. But the big kicker is the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force. They are definitely not a navy. I have to caveat that. They still fly the Japanese Rising Sun flag that was used during World War II. It originated before World War II, and it was used during World War II. And that symbol has a lot of problems. South Korea has traditionally balked at any involvement with Japan when they have that flag flying.
Right. Would it be like fair to say to China and South Korea that is their equivalent of the Nazi flag?
It is a very commonly used comparison, yes. So, and yeah,
perhaps not a perfect one.
Not a perfect one, but I'm definitely not disagreeing with it. It definitely has a lot of reasons why it is very, very yeah. So South Korean forces are supposed to salute the flag of the host country who's doing the fleet review, which would probably involve the Rising Sun flag. And I don't know, Nate, you know a lot about Southeast Asia too, but I don't know how comfortable people would be from those countries with their military saluting the flag of the country that colonized them for 20 some odd years. However long it was.
Yeah, it would definitely not be something that people are super anxious to do. From my vantage, I think it would be worse. It's worse for the South Koreans to have to do that because the nature of Japanese colonialism was far more brutal. That's my reading. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, pretty accurate.
And so, Scott, you'd say like this is a sign of trying to have closer relations. But I mean, what do you think this realistically means? So best case scenario, they hold this fleet review. They're able to hold their tongues while they salute these nasty flags. And then after that, Korea-Japan relations are great or what?
They're starting to get better. Traditionally in South Korea, the conservatives are more willing to lean closer to the United States and Japan, at least especially with security concerns regarding China and North Korea. Pardon me. So what I'd see is, there's still that trade war that's been going on since under the moon, the previous president administration. They started a trade war that's still kind of going on, and we can see that finally ending, and then we can probably see some resumption of mostly normal ties between the two countries, because Japanese businesses really like South Korean tourists. South Koreans would go there all the time. There's lots of flights between, Seoul, Incheon, and Tokyo, and Busan.
Right.
So,
and you could say with economic difficulties mounting, the motivation to say, let's bury the hatchet, at least for now, because the economy sucks and we don't need one more problem on our list.
Yeah. and the economy sucks. And obviously the security problems are a big deal. The countries are worried about it. And I see Joel just has another question about North Korea. North Korea is driving this fear. North Korea, and to some extent China. And South Korea is concerned that North Korea might actually attack. That is a possibility. I don't want to say distinct possibility, but there is a possibility that in the few years when there is a Taiwanese invasion or Taiwanese conflict, Japan's worried they have to get involved. South Korea is worried that North Korea might take that opportunity when everyone's distracted to maybe press their issues or maybe restart something. So we do see that worry of they all have kind of common enemies. And it is that saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So I don't know if Japan and Korea will ever be good friends, but I think they do have a very vested common security concerns.
Well, not to sidetrack us, but you mentioned Taiwan, so I feel it incumbent upon me to bring up my necessary caveats that we do not see any sort of Taiwan invasion happening anytime soon, especially nothing changing from the party Congress. Xi Jinping was empowered, so he can do what he wants to policy-wise more easily now, but there's still a lot of constraints on China. They're not economically ready for this. Many would say not militarily ready for this either. But, as he surrounds himself with all his best buddies and no one wants to tell him no, there's certainly an echo chamber risk in Beijing, which affects all policies, Taiwan included. So that's sort of the short 30-second, nothing has changed yet from the party Congress regarding Taiwan. But as always, stay tuned.
I will add something to that, is that despite there still probably being a low likelihood of an actual invasion, all the regional countries are concerned about it and are making moves to address the potential risk of that happening. So it's freaking people out a little bit, at least, making contingency plans.
But yeah, seeing a sort of remilitarization of the Indo-Pacific, where many of these countries, Japan included, have thought for the longest time, we don't have to worry about security. Other countries can help us out with that, other unnamed countries. And while we can just worry about economics, and yeah, the Taiwan issue, whether or not there's an invasion coming in the next 5 years is freaking people out and causing some new investments in militaries for sure.
Right. There's a new rush to rearm in a region that really didn't have to for a very long time. And they're not super stoked about it. It's making people very worried.
Yeah, well, it's expensive, right? You'd much rather spend money on bread and butter items than guns.
And these countries are all experiencing hyperinflation, food insecurity, especially down in Southeast Asia. We talk about that sometimes due to the war in Ukraine, driving up food and fuel prices. A lot of countries are like, do we really want to spend a lot more money on bullets and bandages rather than, milk and honey and bread? So it is kind of the eternal question there.
If we can hop on one final issue here before we sign off, getting to the top of the hour, I did want to turn back to you, Nate, about what seems like a single Asian country issue. That's Malaysian politics. And you've been following it pretty closely, but I'm curious, there's a election coming up. The UMNO coalition is trying to keep hold on power, and the fragmented opposition is trying their best to gain seats, which is sort of like the age-old tale in Malaysian politics. Does any of this matter for like Malaysia's foreign policy in the region, or is this all local to Malaysia? Parties trying to get their piece, but overall Malaysian policy in mainland Southeast Asia will remain pretty much the same after the elections?
As far as an election issue, foreign policy does not come up basically at all. So to Scott's point, the country's dealing with major inflation, a sputtering economy. They're angry about corruption. They're angry about developments in the judiciary there. So it's very much more domestically focused. I would say that Malaysian foreign policy and they're also a claimant in the South China Sea. They also have overlapping claims there with both Vietnam and China. So they're a party to that whole thing as well. But as a smaller country, a middle power who are even less powerful than Vietnam, they'll also be forced to sort of bide their time on that, seek multilateral solutions. They won't be able to actively, directly confront China on the issue of their overlapping claims. So foreign policy is definitely a back burner issue as the November 19th election approaches.
Yeah, which I guess on the one hand you could say is a bit of a positive development. There's at least no new tensions, or at least people acting on new tensions in foreign policy, even if these issues are there.
Yeah, and certainly nobody's campaigning on fervently nationalistic grounds of we have to defend our turf or anything like this. Of course, nationalism is a huge part of Malaysian domestic politics.
Right, ethnic nationalism.
Yeah, that has more to do with the diverse makeup of the population and the various tensions between the ethnic groups that live in the country, and less to do with pushing it outwardly to foreign countries.
Well, thanks, Nate. I don't envy anyone who has to follow Malaysian politics. It is a whirlwind, but I'm glad you're doing it for us. Okay, let's start to wrap it up here. If you are looking forward to any of our other analysis on Asia in general, the shenanigans going on with China, Taiwan, Russia, Ukraine, any of this, please check out worldviewstratfor.com. Otherwise, thank you so much and see you next time.
Thanks, everybody.